We sold the piano for $11. The silence it left behind was louder than the dust. That piano had sat in the front room of a 3-room house on 40 acres of red Oklahoma clay since the autumn of 1921. Henry Briggs drove it home on the back of a borrowed wagon, a Kimball upright with a cracked middle pedal and 18 keys that still held their tune perfectly. He had paid $62 for it at an estate sale in Guyman. Margaret, his wife of 2 years, had not asked for it. She had mentioned it once, in passing, the way a woman mentions rain during a dry week, not as a request, but as a memory of something she once had. Henry heard it the way he heard most things Margaret said, quietly, and all the way through. She played that first evening with the windows open, and the September air warm enough to carry the sound across the yard. Their dog, a brown and white mutt Henry called Patch for the white splotch over his left ear, sat on the porch and tilted his head at every high note. Margaret laughed at that, not the polite kind. Henry stood in the doorway with his boots still on and his hat in his hand, and watched her play a hymn he did not know the name of. He did not ask. The sound was enough. For 13 years, that piano was the last sound in the Briggs house every night. Margaret played after supper, after the dishes, after Henry had come back from checking the animals smelling of hay and the particular sweetness of Oklahoma evening air. Their daughter June was born in the spring of 1927. She grew up beside her mother on the bench, a small girl with dark braids and hands too small to reach a full octave, pressing keys one at a time while Margaret played around her. By the time June was 5, she could play the opening bars of Shall We Gather at the River with both hands. Margaret never corrected her when she missed a note. She just played louder around the mistake until it sounded like it belonged. The bench was pine, with a hinged seat that opened for storing sheet music. Henry had sanded it twice and repainted it once, a deep brown that darkened each year, until it looked almost black. It held every scratch June's shoes had made, every ring Margaret's coffee cup had left, every hour the two of them had sat side by side making sound together. Nobody thought much about the bench. It was just where you sat when you played. Henry worked the land the way his father had, and his father's father before that. 40 acres of winter wheat, planted in September, harvested in June. Enough in a good year to pay the bank and set aside a little, and buy his daughter new shoes in the spring. In 1929, he cleared 200 bushels and got $1.10 per bushel. He said it was a good year. He said there would be more. He said this standing in the kitchen doorway with red dust on his boots, and Margaret playing something slow in the next room, and their daughter asleep on the bench with her cheek against the low keys. The dust came in 1931, but it came the way most things that ruin you do, slowly enough that you do not leave, and then too fast to do anything but hold on. The first year, Henry lost a third of his wheat to dry wind. He said it would come back. The second year, he lost half. He said less. By 1933, the wheat had stopped trying. The field that once gave 200 bushels gave 43, then 19, then nothing worth hauling to the elevator. Wheat dropped to 6 cents a bushel that winter. Henry stood in that field one morning in April, with the sun white and hard above him, and the dirt lifting off the ground in low brown curtains, and he did not say a word. He came inside and sat at the kitchen table, and put his hands flat on the wood, and stayed there until Margaret set a plate in front of him. Boiled turnips and the last of the salt pork. He ate without looking up. June was 6 years old that year. She asked her mother why the sky looked like the inside of a paper bag. Margaret told her the wind was carrying dirt from somewhere far away. June asked where the dirt was going. Margaret said she did not know. June said maybe it was going somewhere better. Margaret turned to the stove so her daughter would not see her face. That spring, Henry sold the cattle, 4 head, for $21 total. A man drove out from Boise City in a truck that rattled so badly, Patch barked at it without stopping. The man counted bills on the tailgate, looked at the cows, and said he was doing Henry a favor. Henry folded the money into his shirt pocket and watched the truck drive away until the dust closed behind it like a curtain. Margaret made corn dodgers that night with the last of the cornmeal. June ate 2. Henry ate 1. Patch sat under the bench. He had always slept under the bench, since the first week they brought the piano home, and Margaret slipped him the piece she had not eaten. After supper, she played for 40 minutes, longer than usual. June fell asleep on the bench, with her head against her mother's arm. Henry sat in the chair by the window and watched the dust settle on the sill in a thin brown line that would be there again by morning, no matter how many times Margaret wiped it. The music did not fix anything, but it made the room smaller and warmer, and closer to what it had been before the dust decided to stay. The black blizzard hit on a Sunday in April of 1934. June would remember that day for the rest of her life, not for what it destroyed, but for what it sounded like. It sounded like nothing. The sky went from white to brown to black in under an hour, and then there was only the wind and the dust hitting the glass, like sand thrown by a fist. Margaret stuffed wet rags under the doors and pressed damp cloths around the window frames and pulled June under the kitchen table. She held a wet rag over her daughter's nose and mouth and said, "Breathe slow. Just breathe slow." Patch pressed against June's legs, shaking so hard his teeth clicked together. Henry put his shoulder against the front door and held it shut. His face was wrapped in a handkerchief that turned brown in minutes. The sound went on for 4 hours. When it stopped, the silence was worse than anything the wind had done. Margaret opened the front door, and the dust slid in like water, 3 inches deep on the porch, an inch across the kitchen floor, a fine brown powder on every plate and cup and surface in the house. June coughed for 2 days afterward. The doctor in Guimont said her lungs sounded clear, but to keep wet cloths over her face at night. He did not charge them. He had stopped charging most families on their road months ago. Patch found a dead jackrabbit behind the house that evening, and dragged it across the yard and up the porch steps, and dropped it at June's feet like a gift. June laughed, a real laugh, sudden and startled, the first one in a week. Henry looked at the rabbit, looked at the dog and said, "Well, at least somebody around here is still working." Margaret covered her mouth with her hand, but the smile came through anyway. It was a small thing, a dog and a dead rabbit, and a bad joke, but it was the first moment that felt like a regular evening in a long time. The dust on the porch rail caught the last of the sunset and turned gold for half a second before it went brown again. The piano had been covered during the blizzard, but it did not matter. The dust had gotten inside, into the hammers, into the strings, into the felts that cushioned each key. 3 keys stuck that first week, then 5. Margaret played around them the way she had always played around June's missed notes, finding the melody in what still worked. But each week another key went silent, and by summer the piano sounded like something trying to remember what it used to be. Henry did not say they should sell it. He said they needed $20 to make the next payment to the bank. They had $11.40 in a jar on the kitchen shelf. The piano was the only thing left in the house that anyone else would pay money for. He said it looking at his hands, not at Margaret. He always said the hard things that way. A man named Crutchfield came from Texhoma on a Thursday morning in August, with a flatbed truck and a boy. The boy was maybe 15, with long arms and a sunburn that peeled across his nose in pale strips. They lifted the piano between them, while Margaret stood in the doorway of the front room and watched the shape of it leave. The Kimball upright that Henry had driven home on a borrowed wagon in the autumn of 1921, $62 then, 13 years of hymns and June's mistakes, and the sound of a family being itself at the end of the day. Crutchfield counted $11 onto the bench. Margaret told him the bench was not part of the sale. He looked at it, pine, scratched, the paint wearing through to bare wood. He shrugged and carried the piano out the door without it. We sold the piano for $11. The silence it left behind was louder than the dust. June came in from the yard and saw the empty space. The wall behind where the piano had stood was a different color, lighter, cleaner, a shape preserved for 13 years from dust and smoke and sun. A ghost of the piano printed on the wall. June stood in the doorway and looked at it. She was 7 years old. She said, "Mama, who is going to play now?" Margaret did not answer. She was sitting on the bench, the pine bench with the hinged seat, the one nobody had wanted, in the middle of the front room, facing the bare wall, with her hands in her lap. That evening Henry came in and found them both there. June on the floor with Patch curled against her side, Margaret on the bench. He sat down beside his daughter and said, "I asked him if the bench was included, and he said he had his own. Said it did not fit his truck anyway." Margaret said one word, "Good." And that was all anyone said about the bench that day, or any day after. If this story is finding you at the right moment, there are more where it came from. Subscribe so the next one reaches you too. The decision to leave came in October. 9 families on their road had already gone. Henry sat at the kitchen table one evening and counted what they had left. $22. A truck with a radiator that overheated every 60 miles. A dog who still dragged dead rabbits to the porch. A daughter who coughed in her sleep. A wife who had not played music in 2 months. He did not count the bench. Margaret did. They packed on a morning in late October, the first cold morning that year, the kind that smelled like it might carry rain but never did. Margaret wrapped the bench in the quilt her mother had pieced together in 1896, a double wedding ring pattern in blue and white that had faded to blue and gray. Henry looked at it on the porch. He looked at the truck, already loaded, flour barrel, toolbox, 3 blankets, June's shoes, a Bible. He looked at Margaret. Then he picked up the bench and set it on the truck bed, and did not say one word about the weight or the space it took. Some things the dust could not bury. June sat between her parents in the cab with Patch on her lap. She counted telephone poles for the first hour and reached 87 before she fell asleep against her mother's arm. Margaret watched Oklahoma flatten into the Texas panhandle, brown and treeless and wide. Then west into New Mexico, where the dust thinned and the sky opened from brown to gray to something almost blue. Henry stopped once beside a dry creek bed to let Patch run. The dog found a rabbit hole and barked into it for 5 solid minutes, while June crouched beside him laughing. A real laugh, careless and loud, the kind Margaret had not heard in weeks. Margaret leaned against the truck with one hand on the quilt that held the bench, and listened to her daughter laugh and did not cry, though she could have. The sun was dropping behind them, behind Oklahoma, behind everything they had sold and lost and left, and the light that caught June's hair was the color of gold. They reached Bakersfield on the 4th day. Henry had heard there was cotton work in the San Joaquin Valley, and there was, though not as much as the handbills promised. A grower named Leland gave them a cabin at the far edge of his property. 1 room, a stove, a wood floor, and a roof that did not leak. Margaret opened the window the first morning and stood there a long time. The air smelled like green things growing. June pressed her face to the screen and said, "Mama, it smells like rain, but there is no rain." Margaret put her hand on her daughter's head. She said, "That is what the ground smells like when it remembers how to grow." Henry picked cotton for 14 cents a pound. His hands cracked and bled along the knuckle lines, and he wrapped them in flour sack strips every night and went back every morning. Margaret took in washing from 6 families, $2 a week. June started school in January of 1935, wearing a dress Margaret had sewn from a flour sack printed with small blue flowers. Her teacher asked where she was from. June said Oklahoma. The teacher asked if she missed it. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said she missed the piano. The bench sat in the corner of the cabin. But some evenings, after June was in bed with Patch at her feet and Henry was outside, Margaret would lift the bench to the center of the room. She would sit on it with her back straight and her hands raised and her fingers moving over keys that were not there. She played silently, the hymns, the mistakes. Patch would raise his head from June's bed and tilt it to one side, listening to nothing, the same way he had tilted it at every high note on that first September evening in 1921, when the windows were open and the air still carried the sound. June watched from her bed. She never said a word about it. She watched her mother's fingers move through empty air, pressing down on silence, and she understood something she would not have words for until she was much older, that the music had never been inside the instrument. It had lived in her mother's hands, and her mother's hands were still here. Henry found steadier work at a packing house in the spring of 1936. They moved to a 2-room place on the edge of town, with a proper kitchen and a window that looked out on a pepper tree. Margaret kept taking in washing. The money paid for June's school books and a new pair of shoes each September. Patch grew old the way farm dogs do, slowly and without complaint. He slept longer each day, moving from the porch to the kitchen floor, to the spot beneath the bench where he had always felt safest. He died on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1938, curled under the bench, under the same bench he had slept beneath since Oklahoma. Margaret buried him in the yard under the pepper tree and placed a flat stone on the spot and smoothed the dirt with her hands. She did not sit on the bench that evening, or the next. On the third evening she pulled it to the center of the room and sat down and raised her hands and played. June, 11 years old now, tall for her age, with her mother's quiet way of holding silence, sat beside her on the bench. She raised her hands too. They played together, mother and daughter, pressing keys that did not exist, and the only sound in the room was their breathing and the small, familiar creak of the pine bench that had traveled 314 miles in the back of a truck wrapped in a quilt. June finished school in 1944. She took a job at a grocery in Fresno, saving what she could in an envelope she kept in her dresser drawer. She married a man named Arthur Kimball in the autumn of 1948, a quiet man who built her a bookshelf before he built her a kitchen table, and who never once made her feel she was too much of anything or not enough of something else. In October of 1950, June was 23 years old. She walked into a second-hand store on Maple Avenue in Fresno and found a used piano, a Story and Clark upright with a chipped lid and a bench that did not match, and she bought it for $38. She had saved the money herself, $4 a month for nearly a year, kept in that same envelope in the dresser, labeled in pencil, mine. She had it delivered to her mother's house. Margaret was 52 years old. She stood in the doorway and saw it, and put both hands over her mouth. June said, "It is not the same one." Margaret said, "No, it is better." She sat down on the old bench, the pine bench from Oklahoma, and she played Shall We Gather at the River all the way through. No stuck keys, no dust in the hammers. Then she played it again. June stood behind her with her hands on her mother's shoulders, and felt the music moving through her mother's back and into her palms, and she closed her eyes, and she was 5 years old again, pressing keys one at a time, while her mother played around her mistakes and made them sound like they belonged. Margaret played that piano for 21 more years. She died in November of 1971, in the same house in Bakersfield, with the Story and Clark in the front room and the old Oklahoma bench beside it. Henry had gone 2 years before her, quietly, in his chair, with his hands resting on his knees, the way he always rested them when he had said what he needed to say. June kept both, the piano and the bench, until she herself passed in the spring of 2004, at the age of 77. It was June's granddaughter who found the receipt, Lily Kimball, 31 years old, a fourth-grade teacher in Sacramento, with her grandmother's dark braids and her great-grandmother's habit of humming without knowing she was doing it. She was cleaning out June's house in the November after the funeral, folding quilts that still held the shape of the woman who had used them. She came to the bench. The pine bench with the hinged seat and the one loose hinge. It was worn through to bare wood in places. The brown paint was gone. Lily nearly set it by the door with the things she planned to donate, but she opened the hinged seat, the way you open anything that old, carefully, expecting nothing. Beneath a stack of yellowed sheet music and a single photograph of a brown and white dog sitting on a porch, there was a receipt, folded once. $11, written in a hand she did not recognize, dated August of 1934. She turned it over. On the back, in pencil, in handwriting so faint, she had to hold it against the window light to read it. We sold the piano for $11. The silence it left behind was louder than the dust. And beneath that, in the same hand, written smaller, as though meant for no one and everyone at once, June will play again. Lily sat on the bench for a long time. The house was quiet. The November afternoon came through the window and caught the dust in the air and turned it gold. Some things the dust could not bury. Lily kept the bench. It sits in the hallway of her house in Sacramento, against the wall beside the coat rack, where no one would notice it unless they knew to look. Her daughter Clara is 9 years old. She has her great-great-grandmother's hands. Strong, patient, just wide enough now to reach a full octave. She takes piano lessons on Thursday afternoons from a woman down the street, and when she comes home she practices on a second-hand upright in the living room. Not a Kimball, not a Story and Clark, just a piano. The kind that costs more than $11 and less than it is worth. When Clara plays, Lily sometimes walks to the hallway and sits on the old bench and listens. She does not know all the songs her great-grandmother played on a September evening in 1921, when the windows were open and a dog tilted his head at every high note. She does not need to. The house is not silent. The bench is not empty. The sound is enough. A new story arrives every day. If you would like to be here when the next one does, subscribe. We will see you then.